I think we'll make a start, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kyle Gingrich Hebert, and I have the privilege of serving as director of the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center. On behalf of TMTC and Conrad Grebel University College, of which we are a part, I am delighted to welcome you all to our 2021 public lecture. When we postponed this lecture last year on the initial cusp of the pandemic-related restrictions, I was much more confident that we would be able to gather together in person in a year's time. Though it's disappointing not to be able to do so this evening, I am nevertheless grateful for the ways in which our collective move to online events has opened up new possibilities for interaction, dialogue, and collaborations of many different kinds. I suspect that many of you this evening would not have been able to join us had we been doing this in person. So if there is any silver lining to the pandemic, the fact that many of you are joining us from well outside Toronto may serve as evidence of such. For those of you that may not be familiar with TMTC, we are a graduate teaching and research center of Conrad Grebel University College, affiliated with the Toronto School of Theology and supported by a number of Mennonite academic institutions, including Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, Canadian Mennonite University, and Eastern Mennonite University and Seminary, as well as denominational bodies, including Toronto United Mennonite Church, Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, and Mennonite Church Canada. Our annual public lecture showcases original research by Anabaptist Mennonite scholars or on Anabaptist Mennonite related topics in an ecumenical context on the campus of one of Canada's major research universities. Emerging out of TMTC's long-standing vision of being a Mennonite presence at the Toronto School of Theology, the lecture seeks to strengthen the relationships between TMTC and the many institutions and communities it serves. I am grateful that all of you have joined us for what promises to be a very engaging evening. Before we get things properly underway, I want to make a few introductory comments and introductions. Firstly, I'm grateful for the assistance of my fellow Grebel colleagues who are here with me this evening. Many, if not most of you, will have been in touch with Becca Smoot-Entz, graduate coordinator for the Theological Studies Department at Grebel and TMTC administrative assistant. Becca's with us tonight monitoring various email addresses, Zoom functions, and is available to assist with any technical questions you may have. I'm also grateful to have Jeremy Bergen, who is Associate Professor and Director of the Theological Studies Program at Grebel and a TMTC Faculty Fellow, who is with us this evening to assist with fielding questions should there be such a deluge that one of us, more than one of us, is needed to handle. So secondly, and perhaps this goes without saying, given the ubiquity of our use of online platforms these days, please ensure your microphones remain muted for the duration of the evening, except when you are asking a question. I invite you to keep your video on for the lecture and especially for the Q&A session if possible, so that we can try as best we can to foster an engaged dialogue. I don't know if Chris will say anything about his setup, but he can see you all on a screen, and I think it would be nice for him to be able to do so. So if you can keep your cameras on, I think that would be really much appreciated. We will be taking written questions that can be submitted either by email or in the chat, and you are also welcome and encouraged to ask your own questions. Please indicate your interest in doing so by using the raise hand function or in the chat. Finally, I should mention that we are recording this event and we will make it available on our website in the weeks to come for those not able to join us this evening. So as we gather together this evening, I want to acknowledge the sacred land on which the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As part of Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, TMTC is also privileged to operate on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River, that is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I also want to acknowledge that our lecturer this evening is joining us from Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and that many others are joining us from across Turtle Island. So on to the introductions to our lecturer and our respondent. Pleased to have with us Dr. Chris K. Huebner. Chris earned his undergraduate degrees in theology and philosophy from Canadian Mennonite Bible College, one of CMU's predecessor colleges, and the University of Manitoba, respectively, and an MA in philosophy also from the University of Manitoba, and a PhD in theology and ethics from Duke University with a dissertation entitled Unhandling History, Anti-Theory, Ethics, and the Practice of Witness. He is the author of many essays and the co-editor of a number of volumes, including with Peter Dula, The New Yoder, published by Cascade in 2010. His first book is a collection of essays entitled A Precarious Peace, Yoderian Explorations on Theology, Knowledge, and Identity, published by Herald Press in 2006. And his most recent is a collection of sermons and reflections structured around the liturgical year entitled Suffering the Truth, which is published by CMU Press in 2020. His current project is an interpretation of the emphasis in the Christian tradition on the interrelationship between martyrdom, knowledge, and theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And his lecture this evening is a preview of part of that ongoing work. Chris is taught at Duke University and Meredith College, and currently serves as Associate Professor of Theology and Philosophy at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg. Chris is a longtime supporter of TMTC, and it is particularly gratifying for me to be able to welcome Chris because he was one of my teachers. In fact, he tells me that he's in the very classroom where we may first have met this evening, so it's a happy coincidence.
I think, yeah, Grant and Andrew are probably in there too, causing trouble.
I still recall with fondness a reading course on virtue ethics that I did with him and Grant and Andrew, if memory serves, as an enthusiastic undergraduate at CMU. And I think we even cajoled Chris to let us read his dissertation as part of that course. In any case, very good to have you with us tonight, Chris, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture. Before I pass it on to you, I'd like to introduce our respondent this evening, Dr. Nestor Medina. Nestor earned a BRE and MTS from Tyndale University College, as well as an MA and PhD from St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto. His dissertation was entitled Resurrection and Discipleship, Implications in the Christological Thought of John Sobrino. He is the author of many essays and is the co-editor of a number of volumes, including most recently, Reading in Between, How Minoritized Cultural Communities Interpret the Bible in Canada, published by Pickwick in 2019. His first monograph, Mestizaje, Remapping Race, Culture, and Faith in Latino Catholicism, published by Orbis in 2009, won the Hispanic Theological Initiative Book Award. His most recent book, Christianity, Empire, and the Spirit, published by Brill in 2018, aims to uncover the cultural processes that play a crucial role in influencing how people understand reality, express the Christian faith, and think about God. Nestor has taught at the Atlantic School of Theology, Bright Divinity School, Regent University, and for us at Conrad Grebel University College, where I know his course on theologies from the global south is much appreciated. Nestor has also taught at the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cuba and currently serves as Assistant Professor of Religious Ethics and Culture at Emmanuel College in Toronto. Those of you that have been in the TMTC orbit will know that our relationship with Emmanuel Colleges is deep and long-standing, and we're delighted to have you with us as a respondent tonight, Nestor. Perhaps I'll also mention very quickly that Nestor is also one of the keynote speakers at the upcoming conference that we are co-sponsoring with Emmanuel College, Trinity St. Paul's United Church, and the Institute for Christian Studies on the theme of Rethinking the Christian Left from the Belly of Empire. That conference is taking place online this summer, July 23rd and 24th. It's free to attend, and the call for papers is still open until the end of March. So there's still time to get in on that action if you would like to do so. So with those words of introduction, I am delighted to hand over proceedings to Chris and invite you to give us your lecture this evening entitled Absent Fathers, Invisible Mothers, and the Irrepressible Dance of Love, a reading of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues. Chris.
All right, well, thanks, Kyle. I'm gonna, hold on, I need to change that because now I can't see anyone. There we go. I love my time with TMTC and was very much looking forward to being on the campus of the University of Toronto, which is my first and kind of primal memory of the university. So maybe it just feels right to be there, but we're not there. We're here, and here is dispersed. And so I'm seeing faces that no doubt wouldn't have been present in Toronto, as Kyle has already acknowledged, which is wonderful. I've got you all in front of me on a big screen TV in a classroom over at CMU, just because it feels right to look at an audience rather than to speak blindly into cyberspace. So here goes. And by the way, Kyle, I wish you would have told me the description of the lecture beforehand, but I'm glad there's a little bit of a nod to some Anabaptist Mennonite things at the end. But maybe just to set it up, I'm trying to finish up one project which is kind of grounded in a medieval martyrdom narrative, and thinking that it might be fun to move from the medieval martyr, if I can ever get out of there, to the early modern heretic, which is, of course, to say the Anabaptist. And so some of those thoughts have snuck their way into the end, but I don't know. So somewhere in the middle of a rather lengthy and meandering introduction to his book, Disowning Knowledge, the American philosopher Stanley Cavell granted us a brief peek inside the studio in which he practiced his distinctive and somewhat unusual brand of art. In one of his characteristic parenthetical digressions, he shared an insightful comment about an intuition that guides the selection of literary texts he thought deserving of his philosophical attention. Work is to be done, Cavell wrote, and a place to begin is with tales in which one parent is notably and suspiciously absent. The book in which this comment appeared is a collection of his numerous essays on the plays of Shakespeare, many of which are marked by the absence of one parent or another. And this evening, I will follow Cavell's intuition by offering some brief reflections on three such tales. I will attend to some of the themes he explored in his reading of Shakespeare's great tragedy, King Lear, but I will try to give it a different twist by situating it in between two other dramas that Cavell did not discuss. By weaving together these three stories of absent fathers and invisible mothers, I hope to get us thinking about what it might mean to speak of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues. So let me start with the oldest of the three stories, a play called Sapientia, written by the medieval German canonist Roswitha of Gandersheim. Roswitha's drama was written sometime toward the end of the 10th century, approximately 600 years before King Lear, but the story it recounts is much older still. Here's the condensed version. In the year 137, a widowed mother and her three young daughters arrived in the city of Rome from another large Italian city. Some say it was Milan, but in any case, Roswitha makes it clear that she's a foreigner. The mother was a devout Christian woman of noble descent, and she raised her 3 daughters in the fear of God. The mother's name was Sapientia, or wisdom, and she had given her daughters the names Fides, space, and Caritas, or faith, hope, and charity, and from here on out, I'm going to refer to them by the English translations of their names. Although they were quite young, their ages were 12, 10, and 8, they were also said to be wise beyond their years. Together with her daughters, Wisdom began visiting the churches of Rome, and they quickly gained a reputation for winning many of the Roman women of Rome over to the truth of Christ. And this caught the attention of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who summoned Wisdom and her 3 daughters to appear before him in his court. Hadrian was concerned that their stirring up of religious dissent posed a grave danger to the harmony of civic peace that he was charged with preserving. He was particularly concerned that the women who had come under the influence of Wisdom were coming to despise their husbands. They refused to eat with us, his assistant Antiochus reported, or even more, to sleep with us. Understanding the close relationship between power and population, the emperor conceded that this did pose a significant threat to his reign and the order of Rome. But Hadrian was also known for his considerable intellectual capacity. He thought of himself as a champion of the Greek philosophical tradition and was proud of the reputation he had gained as a patron of the arts. In keeping with this sense of himself as a person of knowledge, Hadrian attempted to win the favor of the girls by appealing to their shared desire for knowledge and truth. He offered to take them up as his own children and pledged to help them realize their extraordinary intellectual potential on the condition that they renounce their belief in Christ and direct their worship instead to the Roman goddess Diana. Not only did they refuse this offer, the 3 young girls mocked the emperor's claim to possess knowledge. They teased him about his foolishness and called him stupid for venerating base metal instead of the Creator, before serenading him with hymns of praise to their Lord, Jesus Christ. Now, not surprisingly, this shameless act of provocation by 3 precocious girls did not go over well with the proud and powerful emperor. He responded by separating the 3 sisters from each other and also from their mother, interrogating each of them in turn. And when this proved ineffective, he subjected them to a series of brutal tortures in a last desperate attempt to elicit from them a renunciation of Christ. But the violence he directed toward the girls was equally unproductive. Far from winning their allegiance, it served as the springboard for a surprising series of miraculous occurrences. As difficult as it is for contemporary ears to hear depictions of violence against young women, not to mention the litany of miracles that test the limits of modern believability, I always find it interesting. Some people get worked up about the violence. Some people get equally worked up, maybe more so, about the miracles in stories like this. You can pick your poison. Nevertheless, it's important to note the details of these torments because they play an important part of the allegorical logic of the story. Let me illustrate by recounting the torture of Charity, the youngest of the 3 sisters. Hadrian ordered his men to have a furnace heated for 3 continuous days and nights, and to throw her into the fire when it glowed red hot with its heat. The furnace grew to be so hot that it exploded and burned 500 members of the emperor's army. 5,000, I'm sorry. That was a big furnace. And yet the raging flames seemingly had no ill effect on Charity. She was seen dancing playfully in the fire, singing hymns of praise to her God in the company of 3 men who were dressed in white. Frustrated by the futility of his efforts to subdue the 3 girls, Hadrian finally ordered each of them to be put to death by beheading. The girls responded by declaring that they welcomed the sword and rejoiced in anticipation of their impending betrothal to Christ the divine bridegroom. After the three girls succumb to death by the sword, the story concludes with their mother Wisdom tending to their bodies and preparing them for burial at the third milestone outside of the town. She is said to have spent the next 3 days at their graveside in a state of continuous prayer, giving praise both for the heavenly reception of her daughters and for all that is knowable through science. When she completed her prayer, she is said to have expired in Christ and was buried alongside her daughters by the matrons who had accompanied her. Now, it's thought that this story first appeared in hagiographical literature around the 6th century. It's also included in the Golden Legend, the immensely popular medieval book of Saints' Lives that was first published in 1260. It's about 250 years after Roswitha's version. Contemporary responses to the story tend to be concerned, as I've said, with the question of whether these events actually happened as described, and with the horrific forms of violence to which the three girls were subjected. But these sorts of reactions tend to miss the sense in which the story is structured as an allegory. Indeed, Roswitha's dramatic rendition of the story reads like a veritable checklist of well-known allegorical tropes that were so prominent in medieval martyrological discourse. She alludes to the three holy youths from the book of Daniel, with whom the three daughters of wisdom were connected by a sort of typological relationship. I should just say, some of you will know the St. Demetrius Greek Orthodox Church, right across the campus from CMU. If you go visit there, the very last set of icons on the right side, kind of the New Testament side, is Wisdom and her daughters, and in the very far back left side, the Old Testament side, is the three holy youths from the book of Daniel. So it's sort of right there. I take it that that's the three dudes dressed in white in the furnace. Her account of the tortures suffered by the girls suggests that, like the unburnt bush from which God spoke to Moses, what is holy cannot be destroyed by fire. And her portrayal of Charity dancing and singing in the furnace makes it clear, in case we missed it, that she embodied the virtue whose name she bore. But if there's a distinctive contribution that Roswitha gave to the story, it is in the way she really plays up the epistemological stakes that are in play between the emperor and the four Christian characters. In addition to Wisdom's praising of science in her concluding prayer, Roswitha inserted a humorous episode in which the girls explain to the emperor, by means of a riddle based on Boethian mathematical theory that he fails to comprehend. These sorts of references, however, are perhaps best described as ornamental. If there's an epistemological statement being made in Roswitha's play, it is one that is embedded in the very structure of the story. Trading upon the literary device of personification in ways that are not exactly subtle, it's pretty obvious that the figures of Hadrian and Wisdom represents the traditional contrast between what we might call mere knowledge and the fullness of wisdom. What is perhaps less obvious is the way Roswitha's account of the relationship between Wisdom and her daughters serves to flesh out this general contrast. Faith, hope, and charity are presented, it seems to me, through the force of the whole thing, as the means by which knowledge is transformed into wisdom. This means that it is not so much that Wisdom and her daughters know something that Hadrian does not know. Hadrian's problem is not that he lacks information so much as formation. His relationship to knowledge differs from that of Wisdom because it is not informed by the theological virtues. Now, let me make it clear that I'm not suggesting that this understanding of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues originated with Roswitha. On the contrary, it can be found scattered throughout Christian scripture and tradition. The connection is already suggested by the original legend of Wisdom and her daughters. Roswitha's contribution was to present it in dramatic form, and in so doing, to present it in a compelling and powerful way that made it easy to remember and perhaps even to internalize. Parenthetically, this means that tales of martyrdom are not always or only about the torture or slaughter of innocent victims. There is sometimes more, often much more, to a martyr than being an instance of exemplary piety. Vasiliki Limberis notes, for example, that the Cappadocians framed all of the Christian life within the cult of the martyrs. It seems to me that in a contemporary context, stories of martyrdom are typically understood to represent one discourse among many, and so in a sense, their scope is narrowed. But where martyr piety served as the customary way that people simply showed Christian devotion, the stories of martyrs were often deployed for other purposes. And one of these purposes was the work of interpretation or conceptual clarification. Stories of this sort perform what Cavell has described as a way of seeing things together. For a variety of reasons I won't get into here, I take it that the story of wisdom and her daughters should be read in this manner. Many contemporary readers find it difficult to stomach the heavy dose of allegory in Rotesweet's dramas. Some struggle to get past the sense that her characters are underdeveloped. They suggest that she tilts the balance toward formulaic types and away from real human beings with emotional complexity and depth. Her interest in telling stories about the moral purity of virgin martyrs is likely to strike contemporary sensibilities as quaint and therefore difficult to engage. More importantly, for the purposes of the present discussion, it might be suggested that while she may make a case for thinking that faith, hope, and charity are to be understood as epistemological virtues, she does very little to show what this equation looks like or to demonstrate why it matters. In each of these ways, it can be tempting to dismiss the work of this play, but I think that would be a mistake. Not only because I think she can be defended against each of these charges, but more importantly because reading Rotesweet helps us to make sense of other work that followed in her wake. Let me simply say here that echoes of Rotesweet's vision of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues turn up in some surprising places, like the plays of Shakespeare and the philosophy of Cavell, and maybe, just maybe, we'll see at the end in the Martyr's Mirror. And I think it's fair to read each of these echoes of Rotesweet as commentaries that serve to elaborate and flesh out her kind of general vision. Now, Cavell did not himself put it this way, of course, but I take it that his reading of Othello is an invitation to explore the question of faith as an epistemological virtue. His discussion of the Winter's Tale helpfully sets up an examination of the epistemological significance of hope. And with King Lear, the first work of Shakespearean drama on which he wrote, he studied the relationship between knowledge and love. For tonight, I will limit my comments to King Lear, another story in which a parent is notably and suspiciously absent. That King Lear can be read as a commentary on Rotesweet's Sapientia is perhaps most clearly signaled by the so-called abdication scene with which Shakespeare opened the play. An elderly King Lear unexpectedly announces that he's decided to renounce the title to his throne. So he initiates a process in which he will divest himself of his property and relinquish his hold on power. He reveals to his 3 daughters that he has divided his kingdom into 3 separate territories. In order to distribute the territory among them, he has decided to portion out his property on the basis of how much love each of his daughters has for him. So he invites the 3 of them to declare their love for him. Which of you shall we say doth love us most? Lear asks. that we our largest bounty may extend where merit doth most challenge it. The two older daughters, Goneril and Regan, respond immediately with effusive and flowery speeches about how much they love their father. But the youngest daughter, Cordelia, responds in a completely different manner. And it is at this point that the dramatic arc of the play is really set into motion. Upon hearing her sisters boast about the depth of their love for their father, Cordelia utters her first words in the play, but only as an aside. What shall Cordelia do? She asks herself, but love and be silent. Later, as a second aside, she adds, then poor Cordelia, and yet not so, since I am sure my love's more richer than my tongue. Later, we learn that Lear loves, or at least thinks he loves, Cordelia the most, and he wishes that she so loves him in return. He tried to make it clear to her that she had much to gain by expressing her love for him. What can you say, he asks her, to win a third more opulent than your sisters? Cordelia responds by simply saying, nothing, my lord. Lear is unable to accept this and continues to press her. Cordelia says, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. Though Lear is desperate to hear his youngest daughter tell him how much she loves him, Cordelia finds that she is incapable of doing so. For the Canadians out there, you might have the same problem I do. Whenever I read Cordelia, I hear Gord Downey saying it. If you're having that experience, you can come along with me. I tried to see if there was a connection to work the song in. It doesn't work. So we'll just let Gord echo in our memories. Cordelia refuses to participate in Lear's scheme because she understands that flattery is the corruption of love. She calls it a glib and oily art. She knows that love cannot be bought and sold, that it is incompatible with bribery, with calculation and measurement. Unlike her sisters, she really does love her father, and she is uninterested in offering him anything less than authentic love. But Lear's problem is that he does not understand such love. He tells Cordelia that her price is fallen play and cries out, better thou hadst not been born than not to have pleased me better. The rest of the play follows Lear's descent into madness and demonstrates how it is bound up with we might call the forces of misrecognition. The cascading series of betrayals and banishments that make up much of the play's action is motivated by what Cavell calls the avoidance of love. So we have two intergenerational dramas that feature the relationship of a single parent to three daughters. Two stories that reflect on the connection between knowledge and love, but which move in entirely opposite directions. One story, a wise mother bestows upon each of her three daughters a different gift of her wisdom. These gifts are received by the daughters in a spirit of non-competitive gratitude. In the other story, a tyrannical and irrational father offers his daughters not a gift, but the opportunity to compete for a share of his property. Two of his daughters are all too eager to place their bids and are torn apart by rivalry and jealousy. The youngest daughter, the play's lone figure of love, moves to the rhythms of her own love-soaked heart. She cannot help but love and so refuses the bribe. And for this, she is disowned by her father and banished. If King Lear serves to interpret Sapientia, it does so by presenting a hellish inversion of Roosevelt's vision of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues, in which the relationship between knowledge and love that Sapientia displays is turned upside down and inside out. In the hands of Shakespeare, Rotesweet's comedic vision of knowledge perfected by love is disastrously split apart, as both are violently distorted with tragic consequences. If Sapientia sketches out an image of the well-formed mind, Lear is a drama about the disintegration of the mind. If Sapientia is about the union of knowledge and love, Lear demonstrates that the failures of knowledge that are bound to happen. Lear demonstrates the failures of knowledge that are bound to happen when love has become viciously distorted. So by inverting the comedic structure of Rotesweet's drama, Shakespeare gives us an opportunity to pay closer attention to the dynamics of love. We can learn as much from studying the process of love's dissolution with Shakespeare as we can from drawing attention to its vital significance with Rotesweet. One of the great gifts of Cavell is the close attention he pays to these dynamics of love and his ability to spell them out with subtlety and nuance. So let me now turn to highlight some of the ways I think Cavell's reading of King Lear and other plays of Shakespeare can help us get started, at least, with thinking about what it might mean to speak about love and the other theological virtues as epistemological virtues. And I need to just say that there's so much to say here. So I'll limit myself to making three rather general observations. We can maybe talk about other things. I'm looking at you, Peter, in conversation. I should say at the outset, though, that his main contribution to this discussion might simply be the way that his work serves as a reminder that it's not enough to make a point about the theological virtues, namely that they have an epistemological application. He also helps us to appreciate that this is only possible in the first place if we reimagine what we call knowledge, to understand it as an inherently ethical enterprise. Now that the theological virtues serve to inform the exercise of knowledge is suggested, first of all, in Cavell's influential reading of the abdication scene that we went over earlier, where he makes an important structural observation about the way the play conceives the relationship between knowledge and love. When Cavell first turned his attention to King Lear, it was common to see Lear's words and actions at the beginning of the play as the reflection of one who was already under the grip of full-blown insanity or madness. But he argued that this assumption is incompatible with the movement of the overall plot of the play. On Cavell's reading, it is not the disintegration of Lear's mental capacities that explains his distortion of love, rather it is the other way around. Cavell insists that the distortion of love comes first for Lear. His madness and folly emerge against the background of his flawed character. His treatment of Cordelia is not the outworking of a delusional plan designed to secure her love. Rather, it is the reflection of one who is incapable of loving and being loved. The other side of this observation is reflected in Cordelia's words. Nothing, my lord. That is to say, her silence about love. It is not because she does not love him that Cordelia refuses to speak any words of love to Lear. On the contrary, she is the only character in the play who actually does love him. For Cordelia, then, love comes first. All of her words are words of love, Cavell notes. To love is all she knows how to do. And it is because she is so moved by love that she is committed to speaking the truth. But then this is also why she is unable to utter the lie he tries to coax from her lips. Under the conditions set by Lear, any true words about love are simply unspeakable. And yet this does not mean that love is successfully repressed or that clear thinking is impossible. Cavell refers to Cordelia's silence as her revelation. It is by saying nothing that she exposes Lear's bastardization of love. This is what ignites the rage he directs against her. Lear and Cordelia thus represent the difference it makes when love does or does not nourish and sustain our thinking. Cordelia embodies a form of thought that is infused by love. It would not be wrong to call it wisdom. By contrast, Lear is unable to think because he is incapable of love. All of this suggests another way of reading Cavell's suggestion that the play is about the avoidance of love. Not only does Lear's denial of love lead him to banish Cordelia, I think it's fair to suggest that Shakespeare's play is also an attempt to dramatize the banishment of love and perhaps the other virtues from the world of knowledge. A second contribution Cavell makes to our thinking about love as an epistemological virtue is the way he explores and elaborates the complex emotional register of love. In doing so, he helpfully demonstrates that the infusion of knowledge by love is not simply a matter of mechanical application. It is an art that is subject to subtle and intricate forms of judgment and involves the full range of our personhood. Let me illustrate by taking a closer look at Cavell's account of how Lear gets love all wrong. He depicts Lear as a figure who is desperate to receive or to obtain or acquire love, but who does not know how to, or at least is not capable of, offering his love to others. In doing so, his approach to love is structured as a form of ownership, something that is fully under his control. He construes the object of his love as something to possess, perhaps even as something that would be exclusive to him. This is what the attempts at flattery and bribery play out. Listen to how Cavell summarizes Lear's encounter with his three daughters in the opening scene. I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy quote from Cavell here because I think it just captures his reading. Lear knows it is a bribe he offers, and part of him anyway wants exactly what a bribe can buy: false love and a public expression of love. That is, he wants something he does not have to return in kind, something which a division of property fully pays for. And he wants to look like a loved man for the sake of the subjects, as it were. He is perfectly happy with this little plan until Cordelia speaks. Happy not because he is blind, but because he is getting what he wants. His plan is working. Cordelia is alarming precisely because he knows she is offering him the real thing, offering him something a more opulent third of his kingdom cannot, must not repay, putting a claim on him that he cannot face. She threatens to expose both his plan for returning false love with no love and to expose the necessity for that plan, namely his terror of being loved, of needing love in the first place. End of quote. This suggests that love is a reciprocal exchange. We might say a dance of giving and receiving. Lear was incapable of love because he was incapable of being loved, of being recognized by another. He could not, as Cavell writes, do what every love requires, put himself aside long enough to see through to her and be seen through by her. Cavell notes that the emotion that motivates the avoidance of love is shame, specifically the shame of exposure. And this is also how he approaches the matter of all the sight imagery that's scattered throughout the play. Shame, he suggests, is the specific discomfort produced by the sense of being looked at. It is the feeling that leads us to recoil or retreat from the sight of another, to safeguard ourselves against the risk of being seen. I suppose it's our tendency to turn our video off on Zoom. In this sense, shame expresses a deep fear of being exposed, an anxiety about what might happen if one reveals oneself or an aspect of oneself to another. Because it obsessively desires the avoidance of eyes, Cavell describes shame as the most isolating of feelings. Rather than risk being in a position of vulnerability with others, a person under the grip of shame is confined to a position of radical loneliness. In King Lear, the effects of shame are dramatized through the image of banishment, which Cavell describes as the last legitimate act that Lear has left. In exercising this act, however, he ultimately finds that it is he himself who is banished. Throughout the rest of the play, Lear exists as one who has effectively been sealed off from the rest of the world. Given his account of the way love turns upon both the giving and receiving of recognition, what he calls acknowledgement, Cavell stresses that shame's avoidance of the eyes is also the avoidance of love itself. This is also how he accounts for Lear's attraction later on in the play to the blinded figure of Gloucester. Gloucester's appealing to Lear because he provides him with an opportunity to be recognized without being seen. It suggests he might be able to know and to be known in a way that somehow bypasses the work of love. Even though the meeting with Gloucester sets the stage for Lear's reunion with Cordelia at the end of the play, it does nothing to change his understanding of love. Cavell insists that Lear's avoidance of love and his avoidance of Cordelia carry through to the very end. The third way Cavell helps us to think of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues is through the way he frames the question of skepticism. Now, although he has not made an appearance in the discussion thus far, it is the figure of the skeptic who can be credited with leading Cavell into the world of Shakespeare in the first place. It is not an overstatement to suggest that all of his work arises from the intuition that tragedy and skepticism share a similar structure, or as he puts it, that tragedy is an interpretation of what skepticism is an interpretation of. In Cavell's hands, the question of skepticism that Descartes is often said to have placed at the very heart of modern philosophy is not so much, or at least not only, a theoretical challenge that must be overcome in order to secure the possibility of knowledge. It is also an ethical challenge that revolves around the possibility of acknowledgement and recognition. Cavell notes that the overwhelming tendency among philosophers is to interpret the skeptic as one who is motivated by what he calls a kind of intellectual scrupulousness. But he claims that this is to miss the lesson that Shakespearean tragedy teaches, namely that the skeptic is equally motivated by a form of unacknowledged denial, what we have so far been calling avoidance. It is important to recognize, as Cavell constantly reminds us, that the skeptic also desires knowledge. If there's a problem represented by the skeptic with respect to knowledge, it is not that he gives up on knowledge too quickly, as if his commitment to knowledge is somehow too weak. Rather, skepticism reflects an attachment to knowledge that is, if anything, far too strong, functioning rather like an obsessive preoccupation. This is manifested in the way skepticism requires something more than a best case for knowledge, whether of the world or of another's love. The skeptic demands a kind of certainty that is purified of the possibility of doubt. But not only is this impossible to achieve, it is also unlivable, as Lear and the other tragic figures such as Othello know only too well. So Cavell effectively calls the skeptic's bluff and refuses to take his demands at face value, much like Cordelia did with Lear. Notice how this implies that he has a kind of love for the skeptic. Instead of allowing the skeptic to keep lying to himself, Cavell reads the skeptic's posture of intellectual scrupulousness, big word, as a cover or shield through which he conceals certain important truths from himself. Skepticism's apparent preoccupation with certainty is a way of converting the experience of metaphysical finitude into a problem of intellectual lack, as he frequently puts it. It functions as a way of excusing his emotional dumbness. In particular, he claims that the skeptic's fantastic or fanatical desire for connections that bear no trace of imperfection reflects a sort of all-consuming dissatisfaction with the realization that humans are finite and mortal creatures who are separate and yet dependent on one another in the world. I referred just a moment ago to Cavell's love of the skeptic. One of the distinguishing features of his work is that he pays attention to the skeptic in a way that is unusual in the world of at least contemporary philosophy. At the very heart of his work is the insistence that the skeptic is not all wrong. This marks an important departure from the tradition of mainstream epistemology and its dedication to the task of defeating or at least containing the threat of skepticism. Instead of defending the possibility of knowledge against the challenge of skepticism, Cavell encourages us to recognize what he calls the truth of skepticism. The skeptic is correct, he thinks, to conclude that our relationship to the world and to others cannot be a function of knowing, or at least not what we think of as knowing. What we think of as knowing is a purely cognitive activity that denies the emotions any meaningful role. The skeptic is also right to recognize the sense in which we are separate from the world and from one another. If there is a problem with skepticism, it is not with its conclusions, the rejection of knowledge, the fact of separateness, but let's say with the emotions that motivate them. The challenge of skepticism for Cavell is not centered around its intellectual claims, but rather is concerned with the practical challenge he calls living our skepticism. To try and defeat skepticism as mainstream epistemology does is simply to prolong the problem. This is not a genuine response, but Cavell seeks, because he loves the skeptic, a genuine response. This means that we must acknowledge that there is a legitimate place for the frustrations and worries that motivate the skeptic. We do the skeptic no favors by enabling his denial of these feelings with the same fixation on knowledge that he purports to have. What the skeptic needs, in other words, is the same thing that we all need: to stop avoiding the difficult work of love. And this is where I think Cavell's work also provides an instructive alternative to the approach that's come to be known as virtue epistemology. From its very beginning, in an influential essay by Ernest Sosa in the early 80s, The Raft and the Pyramid, for those of you who studied epistemology and philosophy programs 25 years ago, virtue epistemology has been structured as a response to the so-called Gettier problem. Namely, that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. Gettier's short little essay launched a search for an elusive fourth condition for knowledge, leading some to suggest that the epistemological virtues might be construed as reliable, belief-forming faculties or processes that enable us to hit on the right beliefs and exclude the wrong ones. Here, I simply want to suggest that virtue epistemology continues to assume the skeptic's obsession with knowledge. And if Cavell is correct, then we should not be surprised that it has also struggled to entertain the emotions with the kind of range and depth that he finds in Shakespeare. All of this suggests that virtue epistemology has failed to learn the essential lesson that Cavell claims to have learned from reading King Lear, namely, that what we need is not more knowledge, but the willingness to forego knowing. Now, this way of putting it suggests that there are two ways of approaching the image of disowning knowledge that Cavell uses as the title for this book that draws together his reflections on Shakespeare. If our disowning of knowledge is driven by a toxic mix of shame and jealousy, like Lear's banishment of Cordelia, say, or Othello's rejection of Desdemona, then skepticism will be unlivable. It will work itself out as a form of tragedy. But there's another form of disowning that flows like a cross-current throughout the pages of Cavell's work. This is disowning not in the sense of a stubborn unwillingness or inability to recognize someone or something. Rather, it is the renunciation of our very real temptation to ownership and possession. This is not a refusal of love. On the contrary, it is the very outworking of love, a generous and life-giving act of letting go. It is this sort of disowning that Cavell is calling for with his suggestion that we need a willingness to forego knowledge. This is the posture of Cordelia. And it's also the posture of Wisdom and her daughters. And it is at this point, I think, where Rhodes Street, Shakespeare, and Cavell all seem to converge. Their concern is not with knowledge, anyway, not what we think of as knowing, but with a form of wisdom that holds knowledge loosely because it has been nourished by faith, hope, and love, charity. If Cavell's reading of Shakespeare has a place in this discussion, it is because of the way he shows that Rhodes Street's lofty theological vision is recognizably human and thus potentially livable. Let me try to sum up this attempt to elaborate my intuition that King Lear provides a helpful commentary on Rhodes Street's Sapientia by returning to the quote with which I began, namely Cavell's remark about the importance of attending to stories in which one parent is notably and suspiciously absent. One way to summarize his account of modern epistemology's splitting of knowledge and love is to say that it is a reflection of philosophy's pathological mother denial. In an essay on another one of Shakespeare's plays, Cavell puts it this way, I quote, "What philosophy renders as uncertainty in our knowledge of the existence of the world is a function, say an intellectualization of the child's sense of loss in separating from the mother's body. In its classic formulation, a skeptic can be described as one who reacts with disgust, or at any rate with disappointment, with everything that is represented by the fact that we are born of mothers. And in the face of modern epistemology's rather complacent attitude toward this sense of disgust, the value of Cavell's work is that he takes this reaction seriously and sets out to provide a response. In doing so, he offers an illuminating account of the dangers that can befall us when we deny our very creatureliness, when we repudiate our inescapable mortality. If he is correct, if our experience of skeptical uncertainty with the world, our anxiety about human separateness and finitude, our avoidance of recognition and love, our feeling of shame, if all of this flows from a kind of unresolved separation between mothers and children, then it can hardly be surprising that mothers are nowhere to be seen in the story of King Lear. And it should equally come as no surprise that Rhodes Street develops her account of the theological virtues as epistemological virtues around the close relationship of a mother to her three daughters. So in lieu of a conclusion, I want to end by drawing attention to another story that is centered around the relationship of a single mother and her three children. Cavell's sense of philosophy's mother denial leads me to wonder about the many stories of mothers and children that turn up in Anabaptist martyrological literature, such as the Martyr's Mirror. There is, for those of you familiar, Anna Jans searching the crowd in Rotterdam for someone to take care of her young son, Isaiah, before she is drowned. And there is the story of Macon Bozers giving the gift of a pear to her son when he came to visit her in prison. On a more somber note, we might remember, we probably have seen the children of Macon Vence rooting through the ashes of their mother to retrieve the tongue screw with which she was tortured. As an aside, I think it's interesting that the two items that come closest to functioning like Anabaptist relics, the pear and the tongue screw, which you can see if you go visit the Special Collections Library in Amsterdam, that both of these are associated with these mother figures in the Martyr's Mirror. Maybe just a coincidence, maybe not. But as stories like these pile up, and they do pile up, one gets the sense that there might be something worth exploring here. On the one hand, it's clear that early modern martyrological tradition departs in some significant ways from the discourse of the medieval martyrdom legend, which gave us the story of Wisdom and her daughters. And it's easy to assume that part of this shift was due to the influence of modern epistemological developments and how it gave rise to a new, more narrowly cognitive conception of belief. I used to think that. But I'm starting to have some second thoughts about this assumption. Or at least I'm more and more inclined to think that we should be careful not to overstate this break. So as a way of suggesting that we might be wise to hold this question open, let me close with one last story that can also be taken to offer a vision of love as an epistemological virtue. In the summer of 1560, so about 40 years before Shakespeare is said to have written King Lear, a woman named Suitken van der Houte was apprehended by the ecclesial authorities in the city of Ghent, trying to pronounce my Dutch G's. Excuse me if I choke. She was originally from the nearby town of Oudenaarde, where she lived with her husband, who worked as a weaver, while also running a small school, probably more like a tutor, out of their home. When he was executed 6 years earlier, Suitken took over his work as a teacher. She also remained a widow, raising their 3 young children on her own. Unlike the many Anabaptist martyrs who were put to death by burning or drowning, and I've counted something like 80+%. Suitken is one of the rare ones that was beheaded, just like the daughters of Wisdom. While she was awaiting her sentence at the Gravenstein Castle in Ghent, she wrote her children a long letter that was later published, some suggest by the well-known printer Nicholas Beestekins, who produced the famous or well-known Mennonite Bible. Her Testament, as it was known, became a popular book and was reprinted a number of times. A version of the letter is also included in the Martyr's Mirror, page 646, I think, of the English version. The Testament is notable for the way it weaves together an emphasis on the importance of learning and wisdom with an allegorically rich, much richer than many of the stories in the Martyr's Mirror, an allegorically rich account of the theological virtues, and especially that of love. She repeatedly stressed to her children that they should learn to read and write so that they may get understanding. And she told her son David that since he was the oldest, he was to learn wisdom so that he may serve as a good example for his younger sisters. The rhetorical force of Suitken's letter is heightened by the way she plays with a sense of double meaning that is not unlike Cavell's treatment of disowning knowledge. Suitken introduces her testament by telling her children that it was written by me, Suitken van den Houte, your mother in bonds, written with haste, shivering of cold, out of love. But through the many examples included in the letter, she strives to teach them that, and this is a quote, all relations are to be based on love, which is the perfect bond. She concludes by encouraging her children to follow the little flock, those who walk most in love. The Dutch word zoet, from which she gets her name, means sweet and gentle. which seems fitting for someone who can be said to embody a sense of disowning love that is at the heart of Cavell's reading of Shakespeare. Now, Mennonite descendants of Dutch Anabaptists like Sütken are well known for their deeply ingrained aversion to dancing. And in fact, Sütken explicitly identified dancing as one of the worldly pleasures from which her children should refrain. So this goes way back. But at the same time, I find that her writing reflects an image of the irrepressible dance of love that was so strikingly presented in the story of Sapientia. This suggests that there might be more to the martyr's mere than an argument for believers' baptism and a celebration of Christian defenselessness. It gives the impression that it might include a rich collection of epistemological undercurrents that have not yet been explored. But that is going to have to wait for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Give her a virtual round of applause. Wonderful, so much to consider and chew on. I'm going to hand it over to Nestor for a response. You can start thinking of your questions and formulating those. But Nestor, please, hand it over to you.
Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, whatever you may be. Just want to make sure I cover all the kind of time zones. I think this is probably I hang out a lot with Mennonites, but this is kind of probably the biggest crowd that I've been with, so I'm a little bit intimidated. But anyway, I am grateful for being invited tonight to participate and just enter the conversation. And I must confess that after reading and now after listening to Professor Huebner's paper, I am left with the same level of perplexity as when Professor Gingrich Hebert invited me at the beginning. This is about a year ago or so. I was taken by surprise because, as I said, although I hang out with Mennonites quite often, my area of research is liberation theologies, cultural theory, and decolonial debates. So there are very few points of connection for cross-fertilization. Additionally, Professor Huebner's paper deals with an area of study which is entirely foreign to me, insofar as I do not have the scholarly familiarity or expertise with Shakespeare's work or Cavell's work, as I believe is necessary to adequately engage some of the points he raises. That said, and because I am already in front of you, I feel compelled to respond from a peripheral sort of a position. And so I hope you will not be surprised that I'm coming from way out left field. And so my comments are intended just to hopefully elicit a little bit more of a conversation. To that end, I have titled my response, Absent Peoples, Unaccounted Mothers, and Repressed Knowledges, the Legacy of Empire. So here it goes. Huebner invites us to consider his proposal of theological virtues as epistemological virtues. He uses Roswitz of Gandersheim play Sapientia, sorry for the mispronunciation, Shakespeare's play King Lear, and Stanley Cavell's philosophical approach to Shakespeare's work to help us consider other ways of thinking the connection between knowledge and virtue. And as I listened to Huebner's proposal and read him, the conspicuous lack of presence of the mothers become evident, as he pointed it out, at least in a way that they lack a significant role in each of the sagas. The mothers appear or not appear out of a deficit. Of course, the absence of the fathers is also relevant. Though in Sapientia, the mother is an important character, she only appears in a supporting role. While we are told that women fell under the influence of wisdom, she says, the attention of the play falls on the three daughters, faith, hope, and love. The father is one who remains invisible in this play. The opposite is true of King Lear, where the mother is only present by proxy by the existence of her daughters. The father, however, is hard to miss in the plot. This dynamic of presence and absence makes this conversation most enticing insofar as thinking through the absence of wisdom and theological virtues as signaling the presence of the kind of knowledge that can be acquired, manipulated, and commodified. So I wonder, and this is a question for Professor Huebner, whether one of the implications here is that the absence of knowledge that can be purchased or acquired as property necessarily means wisdom and theological virtues are present. Would this be equivalent to what Cavell calls foregoing knowledge? The question of the presence and absence of theological virtues and wisdom as other forms of knowledge is an intriguing one for me, particularly because wisdom and theological virtues also provide an interpretive frame for living. So 2 points I want to highlight. First, there is an ethical component and should not be neglected. As someone who works with liberation theology and decolonial debate, I must ask Professor Huebner, what do these theological virtues look like on the ground? How do we escape the world of ideas, speculations, and abstractions? Of course, Huebner anticipates this question by engaging Cavell in detail, highlighting the role of emotions, shame, and skepticism as constitutive posts for interpreting theological virtues as epistemological virtues. But the concreteness of his proposal does not come until he engages Sutken van der Houta, or Houta, and I apologize again for the bad pronunciation, 1560 letter to her children as she, while under the yoke of lovelessness, charges them to base all relationships on the perfect bond of love. But it is at this juncture that I hit a dead end, as the notion of love remains forever elusive for me because I do not know what this perfect bond of love actually looks like. Huebner reminds us that Sutken reveals lots more than mere theological commitment for believers' baptism and the impolitic violence that Mennonites experienced during the 16th and 7th century. But we are left waiting for a conclusion as he leaves the question open, because there is obviously much more to think about the connection between martyrdom and virtue. But as I was thinking about this at the end of his paper, it occurs to me that there are some chronological connections between the martyrdom or the experiences of Anabaptists and Mennonites, stories of suffering, and the indigenous people of the Americas, even if only by coincidence. Here I wish to revisit 3 different stories to invite us to think about the connection between knowledge and virtue otherwise. The first relates to martyrdom, and it refers to Bartolomé de las Casas' brevísima relación de la destrucción de las Indias, or in English, short account of the destruction of the Indies, which was published in 1542. The book documents the atrocities committed against the indigenous people of the Americas by the Spanish post-1492, the date when Christopher Columbus stumbled on Abya-Yala, Nepantla, Huizet-Kayak, and Turtle Island, and made the monumental mistake to call it India. That aside, the Dutch and the English took those stories that Bartolomé de las Casas wrote and published them under the label The Black Legend to discredit the Spanish and accuse them of being savage and thus reject the hold the Spanish monarchy had on the Dutch. Among the atrocities that de las Casas documented is the incident of Atuey, an indigenous Caribbean cacique, a chief who is tied to a post where he will burn alive for his refusal to accept becoming a subject of the Spanish crown and a Christian. The priest is called to give him their last rites and entreats Atuey to convert to Christianity so that he can go to heaven and not hell. And in his simple words, not knowing Spanish full well, Atuey points to the Spanish soldier and asks, "Are they also going to heaven?" The priest, surprised at the question, responded, "Of course, they are Christian, Then Hatway said, I'd rather go to hell. I do not want to be in a place with people like them. The second story I want to mention is that of the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, whose writings have remained silent or not very well known. Ironically, he was born before, had a longer literary trajectory comparative to, and died the same year than Shakespeare did. But as a descendant of the Incas and a Spanish noble, he dedicated his life to documenting the history of the Incas of Peru. This daring act caused him to be exiled to Spain and prevented him from seeing his Inca family until his death in Spain. His writings were later added and included in the Index Librorum Prohibitum, that is the list of prohibited books by the Spanish Inquisition. These two stories, that of Hatway and Garcilaso de la Vega, illustrate the power of knowledge otherwise, the power of those stories which expose the impolitic character of empire and colonization. The last story corresponds with a book of stories with a value much like the Bible for the Quiche Maya people of Guatemala and Mexico. This book was written around the beginning of the 16th century, but it remained hidden until 1701 when it was discovered in Chichicastenango, Guatemala. I refer to the Popol Vuh, which became a dangerous book during the Spanish colonial societies because it chronicled the millennia-old story of creation of the Mayan people. Nevertheless, with all its power and influence, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Christian Church, did not manage to eradicate this book or its stories from the memory of the indigenous people. Now, this begs the question, why am I telling you all of these stories, right? On one hand, because they are probably stories with which you are not too familiar. This lack of familiarity, I want to suggest to you, is part of the larger complex of colonization of knowledges through which the Western European North Atlantic intellectual tradition arrogated to itself the center of the world and which made all other forms of knowledge not worth knowing about. Yet, it is these stories as suppressed knowledges that help us to also reorient the understanding of theological virtues as epistemological wisdom otherwise. These stories do not come from those who claim to know what virtues are or what it means to love unconditionally. They expose the epistemological underbelly of colonization and in so doing reveal the location of virtue elsewhere, outside the centers of colonial power. The incident of Hatway help us see that the theological knowledge of empire and colonization as inherited from the Western European Anglo-North Atlantic colonial project cannot claim to be able to teach virtues of love, compassion, and empathy. Those very sentiments of betrayal, lack of love, murder, shame, and skepticism which Shakespeare conceived in his imagination were in fact enacted among the indigenous and African peoples by the Christian who claimed to know the virtue of love. And the suppression of the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega's writing and of the Popol Vuh reminds us that theological knowledge otherwise can be found among those very people often silenced in the annals of history. My point is simple. Just as Huebner notes that the Martyr's Mirror may be more than about believers' baptism, I also note that whatever happened in Europe during the 16th and 17th century is not unrelated and should not be reflected on separately from what happened in the Americas. Understanding theological virtues when seen from the vantage point of the Americas requires that we accept the fact that epistemological virtues otherwise require that we no longer see historical moments separate from other interconnected aspects that define those historical moments. So here I wonder, and here are my two closing questions for Professor Huebner. What would it mean for us to talk about theological virtue from the underside of empire and colonization? What would it mean for the church to speak of hope, faith, and love if the experiences, voices, peoples and knowledges of the racialized and minoritized peoples are absent from our theological conversations. Anyway, I tend to get excited, so I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nestor. A wonderfully provocative response. Thank you very, very much indeed for that. I think maybe I will give the first word back to you, Chris. Do you? There's some pointed questions on the table. Do you want to take a stab at those before we while we let other people get formulate their own questions?
Only briefly. Thank you, first of all, Nestor, for the wonderfully rich and beautifully succinct addition of three more stories. I mean, I think there's a lot here, and I think you're absolutely right to point to the same kinds of dynamics that I was talking about with Cavell's reading of Shakespeare, the distortion of knowledge into a kind of possessive, almost exclusive form, the tendency to what he calls theatricalize, right? Put the other up on a stage, to turn to stone, to strip life away so that the responsive work is muted from us, right? Which is what undergirds the expressions of power and violence that you're talking about. So these stories are absolutely part of the kind of exploration, I think, that we're talking about today. But of course, you're right to point to the different kind of register, right? Not talking about plays that you go see after a nice dinner and the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Question of, well, maybe I'll just leave it at that. To require an additional kind of interweaving, I think is exactly what these stories demand. What does it look like? And I think we tend to struggle with the kind of thing that I think Cavell so helpfully names, right? We don't like to respond in ways that will probably leave us stumbling, and this is what's so disastrous. Right? The fear of stumbling, the fear of being exposed, the fear of being seen to fail, etc., continue to hobble not only academic discourse but human relations. And what does it look like? We won't know until we simply do the work of responding and failing and listening and so on. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Let's open it up for questions. I see some hands already in, and that's fantastic. If you do have questions that you want to put down in writing, you can also feel free to do that either directly in the chat, or you can send an email to Becca, and you can get it that way as well. So I'll go to Jason Peters. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
One of the English people.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is my my area. So I mean, you've been talking about English. I figured why not go first, right? I mean, one thing I was thinking as Nestor was talking is that obviously Othello is a play that's dealing with this kind of this racial, this whole kind of racialized. I mean, Othello, for those of you who know, he's like the Moor, right? He is. It all revolves around his anxiety about whether he can be loved by Desdemona or not. And Iago is the one, obviously, who raises suspicions for him in the first place. And I guess my question, well, let me preface my question by saying this. So in literary studies, I think, Chris, like some of what you're saying here is really, really pertinent in literary studies, I think. Because like something that's been happening in literary studies, and I don't know about theology or philosophy, but has been a kind of what's called like a post-critical turn in literary theory, where there's a kind of anxiety that maybe some of our suspicion and some of our kind of emphasis on critique blinds us to some of the other dynamics that are going on in texts. So, for instance, something like love, which you're talking about, or faith. These kind of epistemological virtues. We've valorized critique to such a degree that we're no longer really comfortable talking about love or faith or something like that. But I guess the question for me comes up on the issue of like when is it right? So you sort of talked about Cavell loving the skeptic, which I found great. Like I thought that was so interesting. And I'm sort of wondering if you can say anything about when that suspicion or skepticism is like most pertinent. And so what I'm wondering is, so like in a play like Othello or King Lear, part of Othello's problem is that he suspects Desdemona, right? Because he's most vulnerable there. Right, it's like the thing that would make him look most like an ass if it turned out that she was cheating on him, right? And he doesn't suspect Iago, and I guess I'm wondering like why. Obviously this I'm sort of already partially answering my own question, which is, it makes sense to be suspicious of Iago. In fact, he should be more suspicious of Iago, but he is all too quick to be suspicious of Desdemona. And I guess I'm wondering, like, obviously this raises the issue of faith, like having faith in Desdemona, who he loves already, as opposed to having faith in Iago, who he doesn't love. Like, you know what I mean? There's something, I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I'm sort of trying to like raise an issue of like judgment. Like how do you judge, or can you judge when faith is well placed or love is I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna peter off into silence now, but I hope that's suggestive in some way.
No, I mean, yeah. One of the things I love about the way Cavell reads Shakespeare, at least in these three plays, and there's others, is how he kind of flips it all around, right? I mean, he gets us thinking about faith, say, by holding in front of us faith's distortion. So, for Othello, it's an emphasis on kind of exclusivity, right? The exclusivity of the relationship. That is, it seems to me, the kind of distortion of faith that one can see playing out in any number of ways, not least of which are the kinds of stories that Nestor was talking about. What does judgment look like? Well, I mean, it's not going to be abstract criteria, right? But the kind of linguistically embodied carrying forward that again makes it possible for us to go on with one another. It's not going to be a formula, right? This doesn't mean, though, I don't think that we have to choose between, being suspicious. I don't know if that's the right word, critical or not, right? But one of the interesting things we see in literary studies and in much academic work is kind of flip-flopping between kind of critical modalities and what kind of post-critical, more romantic ones. One of the things I love about Cavell is how he's certainly a romantic of sorts, but how he avoids the faddishness of the world in which many of us spend our lives. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think shame is a part of it, right? I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of Virginia Burris's work on martyrdom. I think one of the things that discourses of martyrdom do reflect is a kind of shamelessness, right? I mean, the martyr is one who's there to be seen, And we shouldn't miss that in the stories, especially the older ones. You find in some interesting ways both modern epistemology and discourses of martyrdom informed by stories of dying to know. But one is a kind of a dying to know that's like a, like a detective willing to risk everything in order to acquire and possess knowledge because it's so dangerous. And the other is a kind of a shameless exposure. And it seems to me that we need to then flesh that out with some of the more called the micro moves that Cavell draws our attention to.
Yep, thanks for that.
I'm going to put Cavell in front of Peter and Shakespeare in front of Jason. You guys weren't going to be in Toronto, so.
Let's go to you, Peter. Go ahead.
So I have a whole bunch of sort of questions or comments, but I'll try not to.
I'll send it to me, but get the important one.
Well, I mean, I think so. The first thing I'll say is just how much I admire this paper. I mean, I think the conjunction of the play and Lear is just really helpful. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing is just maybe a comment on some of the issues that Professor Medina raised. I mean, I discovered Cavell and post-colonial theory at the exact same time.
All right.
And the place where, so, Cavell thinks that Shakespeare and Descartes mark this sort of transition point. Well, Luther and Descartes and Shakespeare mark this transition point from to the modern. And of course, that's the point of Columbus and the dawn of the colonial era. And for me, what it seemed was that the way Cavell describes what the skeptic does to the world, sort of objectify it, you have to violate it in order to know it. It just seemed like a description of the colonial encounter. So the connections are really tight. I wonder though if it means, well, so I'll just leave it at that as a comment. And then, so just ask maybe just one question. I was so struck by the contrast between the daughter's response to Hadrian. Was it Hadrian the emperor?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that seems like the parallel scene with Lear and Cordelia has is love and be silent, and the daughters have, at least if I recall what you said, so much to say. Do you make anything of that? I don't know if that's a productive question, but it's one that stuck with me, and I'll save the rest of my questions for next time we see each other, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but they're almost vociferousness, right? I mean, this is the mirroring of these two plays, which struck me. I mean, the first time I was teaching this a few years ago, and I don't think any of those folks are with us here. I just couldn't stop thinking about it, right? I mean, and I mean, one of the responses that happens with, and you see this in say people talking about Anabaptist martyrs and the martyrs' mirror. It's like, well, they weren't very nice in some of those nasty things that they said. In response, it's not very nice to pay, to mock Hadrian for his foolishness. But I think, I mean, focusing on the content of what's said kind of misses the point that's being dramatized here, which is a kind of a bumbling way of saying I hadn't thought of that before, but thanks for pointing it out. I mean, it's tricky to. I don't want to give the impression that Sapientia is allegory and nothing else, because I don't think that's right. I've just picked up, some of you will probably know, what's her name? Jane. The Persistence of Allegory, Jason. What's that book? Well, we like to think of, right, this medieval allegory and kind of modern mimesis, when you get character, and Aristotle gets rediscovered, and that rediscovery of Aristotle coincides with the developments in kind of modern epistemology and science. But it seems to me that that overstatement of the shift is wrong, and that's exactly what got me rethinking the Martyr's Mirror, because we often think of that as a text that should be stripped of allegory, stripped of miracles, and stripped of all the kinds of moves that one finds in these kind of medieval texts. But I read the Martyr's Mirror last summer. It was my pandemic indulgence. And there's a lot of miracles, and there's a lot of allegorical moves, and there's a lot of stuff I didn't expect to see in there. I certainly didn't expect to see like the Mennonite version or the Anabaptist version of St. Lawrence saying, "Look, turn me over. I'm done on that side. Why don't you try me on the other side?" As he's lying on the grill. And so to think of a sharp break between early modern martyrological discourse and kind of medieval allegorical golden legendy, where everybody dies by beheading because you can't possibly burn or drown because those are unchristian ways of dying. It's an overstatement. And all of a sudden people are now dying the deaths that they experienced. One of the interesting things about Sutkin is there's actually a debate about whether she has 5 or 3 children. And in the official version of the story, Brad Gregory has an essay on this in the Arnold Snyder collection, Profiles of Anabaptist Women. And he wonders whether the debate is, or whether the difference is that, Sutkin was the second wife of her husband. It was not included in the Martyr's Mirror because he was a sacramentarian, but that's another story. And so the 5 versus 3 children are explained that way. It seems interesting to me to at least consider that she has 3 so that she fits the kind of template that's in play here. And so how did I get onto this from your question, Peter? I don't know, but I'm rethinking the way I used to think about early modern martyrological discourse being bound up with a kind of cognitivization of belief. It's tempting to read it that way, but I'm wondering.
Right, and then you have an argument with Cavell that would be interesting if you make explicit, because he clearly does.
Does in some ways. Beckwith, I think, pushes on some of that. In fact, it's only really with Beckwith that I started to see Cavell as a reader of the theological virtues. For example, she's right that The Winter's Tale is about hope. Cavell doesn't see that. He tends to fixate on faith and love and misses hope. But The Winter's Tale is clearly a drama about hope as a kind of epistemological virtue. Marriage dramas are faith, right? Childbearing and birthing is hope, always and everywhere. And then love is, in a sense, either of those kinds of relational forms when they are working well, right? You can have both marriages and intergenerational kind of parental relations. So yeah, Beckwith is, for those of you who know her work, she's there, though I didn't mention her.
That's great. Thanks for that, Chris. We've got a question in the chat from Thomas Reimer, so I'll read that out. How do we learn love, Thomas asks. How is it mediated to us? As a theological virtue is traditionally seen in Aquinas, for example, as a grace of God, mediated through the ecclesiastical hierarchy through sacraments. What happens when the sacraments are called into question, as they are with the Anabaptists? Is there an idea of direct infusion of grace, or is it mediated through different institutions of marriage, for example, and various other forms of community? Are these the sites where colonialism can be resisted?
I'm not sure about the latter. As if there's a privileged site. Yeah, I forgot to say, talking about medieval things with the medievalists is equally foolish. I've been wondering, Thomas, and I'd love to talk to you further about this, about the theological virtues as infused virtues, and exactly how we make sense of that. I mean, I think it might be, well, let me say it this way. I'm struck by how Wittgensteinians tend to be drawn to Aquinas, and who, of course, is at the heart of Cavell's work, and at the heart of how learning happens, right? I mean, we learn by learning how to speak to one another, which is, sounds much more organic than the kind of mechanical understanding of the sacraments that we tend to assume. But it seems to me that is to split apart two modes that properly belong together. I don't know if that works. But we learn love by hearing our parents and those who speak the language of love to us communicate, and to lie about it. I mean, the way Wittgenstein kind of works over the opening quote from Augustine on language learning, as if a child is learning a second language as an adult, it seems to me is pertinent here. And if I could remember it, there's a beautiful quote somewhere in the opening section of Claim of Reason about that. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Thomas? I'd love to hear you to say more.
There, I got myself unmuted. It wasn't really a question towards an answer, but just kind of thinking about how it works in how love works within a community, and how it's mediated that way. Because knowledge also tends to work that way, and definitely in the case of kind of colonial impositions. That's just where my mind went. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's also the medieval distinction between certain kinds of knowledge as science, as scientia, and wisdom is slightly different from that, precisely because it involves the virtues, like the moral virtues, whereas scientia, you can use it ill, you can use it well.
Yeah. I mean, you go with Rothschild and you don't get into kind of the intricacies of kind of scholastic.
Yeah, of course.
But which isn't to say, I mean, I use, and I probably shouldn't, the term knowledge, right, when talking about wisdom. It's knowledge, it's understanding, right, all of these so-called gifts of the spirit, of which wisdom is the highest. For us, it's those all, in a sense, become collapsed and maybe narrowed. I mean, the same sort of thing happens with the discourse of martyrdom when it becomes one discourse among others. I don't know, but yeah, I'm all too conscious of all of the forms of knowledge, what belongs with intellect, what goes with will in medieval discussions, which I'm just sort of tiptoeing around here.
Can I quickly ask something about that? Exactly what can I do that, Kyle?
Go right
ahead. Because as you're saying that, Chris, I'm just wondering, because I mean, it seems like in Shakespeare, part of the problem is that these they already do love, like they're kind of loving already. It's like Othello does love Desdemona, and like Lear does love, oh no, Cordelia. Sorry, I had a moment there, and it's like it's in that, like, the vulnerability of their love that they suddenly fall into like this kind of skepticism.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's almost like they don't have to learn love, but they have to learn how to live with their love or something. Like, I don't know exactly.
Well, I mean, I think that's where the discourse of the virtues is helpful, because it's not a question of knowing or not knowing love, but you know, the kind of performance of it, right? I mean, it's sort of like Mennonites and peace. You know, you got to talk about peace, but then it can look like a million different things, right? And it seems to me that there's an analogous move going on in the kinds of plays or the kinds of situations that Shakespeare is kind of wrestling with, right? And notice the move Cavell makes. It's not knowing or what we think of it's knowing. It's not. So there's always love and then there's love. There's always knowledge and then there's knowledge. And it seems to me that's an important move that we miss when we make it a matter, you know, of whether we know or not, or love or not, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I guess I'm just like, because it seems like partially what you're talking about is a kind of like, and now this probably sounds really stupid, but like it's almost like it's not emotional intelligence. You know, like there's a kind of like, because I mean, part of the problem is that there's these like vulnerabilities in our emotional life that are like out of our control to some degree, and you're living with like, I love this person and yet they could hurt me deeply, and I have to trust them and have faith in them and have hope or whatever, but like I can't control exactly, but like I don't know about you, but like for me that kind of vulnerability leads to like rage and like, you know, like all kinds of jealousy and all kinds of negative emotions. And it's kind of partially the problem is like learning how to live with these like both positive and negative emotions, right? Like love is both a positive and a potentially destructive, right?
Right.
Emotion.
And we're never either Cordelia or Lear, but always in a sense, right? I mean, both of those what movements are stirring within us. Yeah, I don't want to get too personal. I see R. Huebner on the screen, which is people who can probably speak to the difficulty of love in a different manner, but maybe they'll stay invisible and muted.
Well, Travis is here to rescue you from that, Chris. So I'll pass it over to you, Travis.
Barely see him.
No, I'm kind of invisible, but that's just how I mean it to be. No lights. We're out here on the heath. There's a lot of talk about virtue. And, you know, like the respondent, I don't know my Shakespeare as well as I should. I don't know Cavell at all. But I don't know that virtue will rescue us in these ways that people seem to think that they will. And it seems to me that in Shakespeare's King Lear, Lear does learn some things out there on the heath. And, you know, the characterization of the blindness that, you know, he doesn't want to be seen and so on. Of course, he's not being seen. He is going mad. He can't see himself. But he learns something there out on the heath that has nothing to do with virtue per se. That is, you know, something that he has been tutored in or trained in. There's something that he only sees when he is devastated as the man whose eyes are gouged out, which, you know, we've heard nothing yet about the God-man who becomes flesh and will draw all in the way of a crucifixion that is a martyrdom, but perhaps not like all martyrdoms, but nevertheless is a drawing through ugly exposure of death as a criminal and the complete inability to articulate the inwardness of the love that is being displayed here, which will be mistaken by everyone as offensive. Lear is offensive, but in that moment, I find him more Christic. And I don't know that I can articulate that in terms of the virtues, but I can think about it in terms of the devastations. I wonder if you have anything to say about that, because I think it relates to colonialism. And if we can't go to places of devastation, including our own complicities in these devastations, we are bearing zero witness to what could be called the prototypical martyrdom of devastation.
So I'm just trying to get a finger on, first of all, I think you'd like Cavell. Second of all, is your worry about the virtues then because that they assume a kind of success, that they allied failure or devastation or destruction? Because I don't see it that way. I mean, I think they make it possible to reckon with precisely those things, because you never get virtues. You know, I mean, Dante. You don't. I mean, you're not avoiding all these things with Dante, but you still got an account of the virtues, which are always kind of bound up with viciousness, right? Including our own viciousness, not just our subjection to the viciousness of others. So it seems to me that, and then of course we could talk about contemporary appropriations of the virtues doing this, that, or another thing, but it seems to me that that's precisely what it opens up, right? As I understand it. So I guess I don't see the force of the question as a question about the virtues.
Well, I mean, let's just think about what Weir means. The man. Let's think about, strength of the virtuous man who display. I mean, I don't see this language as perhaps you do, and I'll think about Augustine in early Christianity, who thinks language of the virtues gets us nowhere on this question, and I think he's right about it in relation to the drama of devastation that was required in terms of the going to the places of suffering, not virtue, because virtue builds us up into the man. and that let's think about it as the male man who has them. We have to go to the places of devastation that get let go of precisely those qualities that we get educated into by our parents. No, this is not what I see in the New Testament at all. Family values in their complexity. No, there's a different kind of thing that requires us to go other places. That's all. Nothing more profound than that.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay. I mean, virtues is just shorthand for faith, hope, and love, though, right? I mean,
And I will just echo what your interlocutor said. They're abstractions. Let's see the drama of where this takes us. I see it in Lear in the devastation of the man on the heath. You didn't go there.
Yeah.
You seem to think that he deserved to go there because he couldn't love in a virtuous way. But maybe that's where he is able to be open to another kind of visitation that is not of his own doing.
Maybe. I mean, I guess I'm asking, how did he get there? Is it knowledge that took him there? Is it love that took him there?
Yeah, his knowledge took him there. Yeah. And where did love take him from there?
This is all very engaged and wonderful conversation. We are coming to the end of our time. I think maybe Nestor can do it. Can I maybe leave the last word? Do you want to weigh in on some of this? We did have a couple of things Thomas sort of asked about colonial. No, Nestor's taking a pass. Okay, absolutely fine. Chris, do you want to have any final thoughts? Churning.
I was kidding. I was just
okay.
I don't want to risk myself out here. It's like a den of lions here, right? No, I'm kidding. I think for me, to begin to think about virtues, my starting point is not and the potential capacity for me to develop those virtues. But my starting point is the experiences of those people who've suffered. And so suffering becomes the starting point for me thinking about virtues. And the same thing for thinking theologically. It is the faith of the people, those that have experienced that kind of suffering, that inform my theology. It is not a concept. It is not a very sophisticated process of rethinking where the divine is, or how may inhabit, or whether he's triune or not. And so all those kinds of things. But my starting point is rather the ground where things are happening. And it is from there that I move to really confront the person of Jesus. That is the one who allows me to see what the divine looks like on the ground, as one who struggles for justice and who resists all kinds of notions, specifically colonization. And so when I engage in the process of resisting those forces, I would like to say that's when virtue emerges and develops and grows into something wonderful and powerful. So that's all I can say.
Thanks, Nestor. Any quick final comments, Chris, before we need to end?
Well, it feels like we're just getting started, but I don't want to prolong it another time. But I'd be curious, Nestor and Travis, I mean, both of you, it seems to me we've got an internally kind of subjective conflict that Travis is pushing, and a less subjective one that Nestor is pushing. And it seems to me that I'm trying to walk in between and annoying both of you. But if the three of us were together and had an opportunity to talk longer, I think we might get somewhere. But Nestor, I mean, I've been thinking about this the whole way. I haven't mentioned it. I'm struck by the way Willie Jennings works. I mean, builds his book around intimacy. And I've been thinking about him as I've been working on some of this stuff, not bringing him in to this particular version of it. But I mean, I think some of what he's doing strikes me as, because I'm working out of some of the same sorts of moves in the sort of context that you're talking about. But again, that's another conversation for another day.
Yes, agreed, Chris. It does feel very much like we are only just getting started with this. Sadly, we do need to end. Thank you very much to you, Chris, for your provocative lecture, to you, Nestor, for being here with us, and to all of you for your questions and for being present here with us. Thank you very, very much indeed. Let's give another virtual round of applause for Chris and Nestor. Thank you so much. Wonderfully engaging evening. The video will be up on the website, so you can tell your friends if they weren't able to be here, and hopefully we can continue these conversations individually offline elsewhere. Thank you very much again for joining us, and have yourself a great evening. Bye-bye.